reading this book, I talked about this last week. Like, I feel like I'm just being cursed with knowledge. Like now I know all these things. Now I know, right? Like that something's wrong, but like I feel like I don't quite have the expertise necessary yet to really dive deep into a React app and be like, oh, this thing is clearly broken. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
As always, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share the podcast with your friends and coworkers, share it on LinkedIn, and you can book time with us on Leland if you want to talk to Nathan and I privately, get some help with your career, anything you might be struggling with technically. And you can just book using the link in the profile. It's funny, I had because I work at Leland, and one of our sales guys came up and said, "Oh, someone's trying to book time with you and Nathan. He called me to do it. He couldn't find your profile." I'm like, how does he know about the podcast, but he doesn't know about the profile? Sure, it's in the episode description. So if that was you, just use it in the profile. And we
and yeah, if you do reach out, I'm pretty aggressive about throwing in some discount codes for first time engagement. So just come talk to me. Come talk to me.
Yeah, just say it from the podcast. Yeah. And say it from the podcast. I'll get clients who we get halfway through the intro call and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, and I host a podcast." Like, I know you from the podcast. It's okay. You can say you know us from the podcast.
They're like, "Oh yeah, I remember you talking about this in Radical Candor." Yeah. And I'm like, guilty as charged.
And stay tuned. We have some author interviews coming your way. We've got several scheduled, and we have recorded one. It's in the bag. And we will release that at a later date. But we are excited. We have some people are very, very excited to talk about. One who, again, we've scheduled it. No reason it shouldn't happen, but hey, you never know. But if we do it, is probably one of the author interviews, if not the author interview, I've been the most excited about out of the whole time on Book Overflow. So stay posted for that. We're very excited. And in the meantime, we will talk about this author and her book. This is, again, Nadia Makarevich. This is Advanced React. We covered the first half of the book last week. We're wrapping up the book this week. We'll give you the book introduction, then talk a bit more about Nadia. Well, let's flip it around. Let's talk about Nadia, then do the book. So Nadia is a front-end architect, coder, writer, and educator at Atlassian. She worked across multiple Jira teams before joining the front-end platform team, where she was responsible for the architecture, build, deploys, and best practices of the entire Jira front-end repository. 3 years ago, she left big tech to join a small startup as a founding engineer. She writes about advanced React concepts and speaks at conferences worldwide. When it comes to React, she's seen it all, and she certainly has, as we will discuss in this book. Because this book is all about advanced React. The introduction of the book is, this book takes your React knowledge beyond the basics. It's for developers who've built simple apps who want to understand how React actually works under the hood. Performance, re-renders, reconciliation, closures, composition patterns, memoization, and more. Each chapter is a focused investigation that builds on previous concepts. Every chapter includes learning objectives up front and key takeaways at the end. So you can read cover to cover or skip to what matters most. Not for complete beginners. You should be comfortable building at least a simple to-do app before diving in. So like I said, we've wrapped up the book this week. Advanced React is in the books, I guess you could say. And Nathan, give us your thoughts on Advanced React after having finished the whole thing.
Again, we talked about this last week. I love the structure of this book. The book does not disappoint. It just keeps building on stuff. And it's one of those things where I'm just like, I thought I knew a decent amount about React, and I was like, I know nothing. I'm just a little baby. I'm a little React baby. But yeah, it's juicier problems. Definitely stuff. If you spend any time in React, you're going to inevitably run into some of this stuff. And sometimes I go, oh yeah, I didn't solve it the right way before. This is much more interesting. So yeah, book's great.
Yeah, and I agree. We gave a lot of praise last week for the structure of this book, for Nadia's talent as an author. I agree 100% here. Reading this, I'm just kind of overwhelmed at how much there is to learn about React.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. We've talked before on this podcast about kind of working with framework or language specific books, if that's something we want to be doing a lot of. We kind of figured, hey, React is easily the dominant front end framework, so we'll give it a pass here. Kind of how we felt about open telemetry a few weeks ago. But these books can be, again, they're not necessarily designed to be read cover to cover, and just the way we do a lot of reading for this podcast, obviously, and so the way I do most of my reading is usually right when I wake up and right when I go to bed. And as you can imagine, you're not exactly primed to absorb some really, really deep technical comments or content at that point. And so just being totally honest with some of the stuff we've discussed here, like some of it kind of flew over my head. I think this is another book that's kind of good to like have in your arsenal to come back and read a specific chapter every now and again. But if you are someone who has been really thinking about React and really thinking, man, I just, maybe you're someone who is kind of like a dedicated front end developer. You're like, I'd really like to take this stuff to the next level. I mean, yeah, like I really can't think of a better book for you. And can't praise Nadia enough. Very, very talented author, and more tech books should be written like this. This is as close to the ideal as possible.
I think this book, and you brought this up in the past, that this is kind of in the same sort of kindred spirit to the refactoring book by Martin Fowler. And I think this is absolutely true in that I could find this book really useful if I was walking into a React code base in which it just didn't pass the sniff test. I'm just like, I don't know why it's not performant, or I don't know why these re-renders seem like they're, not working the way I think they should. It gives you a vocabulary to actually troubleshoot and to address some of those issues. And so even if it's not you just trying to avoid or having a better understanding, you just might walk into a new code base and go, you know what, this is just, it's not right. And then using these tools.
Yeah, I like what you say there about having a vocabulary for that sort of stuff, because I think you can feel guilty, or I don't know, like you're not doing enough if you read a book like this and you don't internalize every single thing that's said to you. But I don't think that makes the book not valuable. I think back to Fundamentals of Software Architecture, which is a great book and one I've been meaning to revisit for some stuff I'm doing at work. And like they go through, like they outline like 7 different kinds of types of software architecture. I'm like, I think I can tell you 3 of them today. But if I were to go back and read the book, or even just to skim it, to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. And you do yourself a favor by just giving yourself that foundation, that base level knowledge. I mean, and I think that's the same with anything. Like Nathan and I both got our master's degrees. I mean, I think I remember doing an operating systems class. Like I can't tell you the ins and outs of how C works exactly. But if I had to go and use C, it would all come back to me. You get something similar out of this book. Gives you that foundation, that vocabulary that I think a lot of engineers are missing. And I once read, someone said on Twitter, they're like, you're about, I think it was like 5 textbooks a year from the most cracked engineer you know. I don't know if that's true, to be totally honest. But if it is true, then we are doing a great job here at Book Overflow of catching up. And
I will tell you that, I think the other part of this is following your curiosity. So, we've been better about, suggesting reordering the queue of books to each other. Either it's something I feel like would be really useful at work, or it's something that I feel like I just kind of career development wise would be useful. And so the two of us kind of have been riffing off of that and trusting that pattern. I also think that you need to make time to just goof around with stuff. And that's not something that we really emphasize in this podcast as much, but I will tell you that like I've personally, I've been working on a little bit of a code base that has React in it. And so the fact that I've been going into advanced React, I'm like, it's been refreshing, because when I make decisions using React, I feel like I'm more grounded, or if I don't know. There's a complementary piece to this, which is, like for instance, Carter, you were doing a bunch of open telemetry stuff at work while you were reading this book. And I would imagine that's like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really,
it really helped. And again, like we read the whole open telemetry book. A lot of it, I'm not gonna say went over my head, but it's hard to like, these are deep, meaty books. But one thing, it talked a lot about just kind of like the open telemetry config file. And like when I was starting out trying to do open telemetry, kind of like looking at these config files, I'm like, what the freak is this? Like it was like magic. Just, I'm like pasting it into ChatGPT. I'm like, this didn't work. What do I do differently? And then having read the whole open telemetry book, being like, okay, I get what we're doing here. Here's our exporters. Here's our, here's our pipeline.
I'm going to throw this out in the worse, but Nadia and Martin Fowler should make a how to structure technical engineering books workshop.
I would read it.
They need to do a workshop, and then we need to like The next edition of OpenTelemetry needs to, go to their workshop.
Yeah. I think some of the tension I'm seeing between this book and my life is, I think someone like Nadia, who's at Jira, and gets to work on the front end platforms team. Like Jira has reached a scale that is like they can really invest in that, and where that's a valuable return on their investment. At my current company, I have a leadership role amongst the engineers, and I don't know. We talk a lot about like startups are dead by default. Like there's a chance that our company doesn't exist in the next 2 years, and so we're constantly trying to like evaluate like the business priorities, and we're not in any danger of dying, right? But we want to make sure that we are making the right moves and building the right things so that we can continue to grow. And what's very nice about Leland is that they haven't recruited any kind of like bottom of the barrel talent, which I've been really impressed with. Everyone there is very ambitious and could go and get a lot of other job offers and do a lot of other things, which is really cool because you have a group of very motivated people. The double-edged sword of that is that we all really, really want it to keep growing and to be like a rocket ship. And so, let's say like we can't secure the next round of funding and like you could just kind of hum along as a business. Like we could do that and that's fine. No one really wants to do that. And I think we would lose a decent amount of our talent if we kind of waved the white flag and said like, right, yeah, this is going to kind of be like a 50 to 100 person company, right? Like no one wants to do that. People at Leland want this to be a big consumer brand, one of the flagship companies in Utah. So with that, we're very, very conscious of what we're building, making sure we're doing the right things. And I play a decent part in that. And so when it comes to like the nitty gritty of React and how we're building our React apps, I appreciate all of the knowledge in this book. Sometimes it gets difficult for me it's just not where my interest lies. It's hard for me to see the return on my investment for things like this. And I don't feel that way, for example, about like OpenTelemetry or like getting our builds on Docker or CI/CD, things like that. Like I see some pretty immediate returns on how that helps us as a team, how that helps us as a business. Deeply investigating the React app to find out what is and isn't performant, I'm like, I don't know. For me, just where I'm at right now,
interesting.
I don't think it's a ton of value.
So we on another project we're working on, it's not in React, it's actually in Vue.js. We recently had a team that was just tooled up the application, and with OpenTelemetry, because they were trying to troubleshoot a database bottleneck. And so I do think that like it's nice to have that. We go back to like what Kent Beck talks about, the optionality piece, which, or he talks about tidy first. This actually fits philosophically into tidy first, which is, do I clean up this thing to make it something that's like high craftsmanship, high maintainability, high performance? Do I do that now or do I do that later? I think making a conscious decision, again, books like this help us make a conscious decision to say, you know what, this array is only going to ever have 50 items in it. We don't have to have, the big O, notation fully optimized solution because only 50 items. If it was 100,000 items, it's worth a sprint cycle of us going in and fixing it. And so I think what's kind of cool here is I think even if you decide, hey, I'm not interested in doing this right now, you can make that decision as an engineering leader and say, you know what? I know that we're probably going to want to revisit how we use refs versus memoization for this thing, right? Like I know this concept. If it ever becomes a bottleneck and it's actually impacting, let's say, conversions of a customer, we'll spend some time on it. But right now, maybe I'll make a note of it and say we decided not to do this because of these trade-offs. And I think, again, that's the sort of like maturity cycle that goes into it. Because yeah, everything's a trade-off, right? And there's this idea that the perfect is the enemy of good, right? Did I say that backwards?
No, perfect is the enemy of good. Yeah,
perfect is the enemy of good, which is that idea that you're like, oh, if I just craft the reference implementation that Nadia told me, then the customers will come to my website. And you're like, no, that's not. Right. No one cares. They want a good coach, and they want to make sure that the checkout process and communicating and their life goals are met, and all these things are in place. And whether React shaves off 50 milliseconds or not. It doesn't matter.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so.
Well, I mean, I guess we can get into
Yeah.
some of these chapters. I mean, so we're at chapters 9 through 16. I guess, yeah, we can just kind of talk about what stood out to us the most.
So chapter 9 actually it kind of builds on where we were for last episode. She started introducing the idea of refs, which are these like mutable state that doesn't impact the re-render. So which is in some cases could be cool, in some cases are super confusing, and she kind of goes over how confusing they can be. The one thing I wanted to bring up is that this book was written at a point in time where React 16, I think, was the latest version. And so I actually started, especially at this point, I started talking to like Claude Code, Claude.ai about, hey, this is a solution in this book on React 16. Has anything changed in 17, 18, or 19 that has done this? In a lot of cases, no, things are the same, or pretty similar. Refs actually did change. And I did want to bring that up briefly just because I thought this interesting. There's this whole like mechanism of like, I do want to use refs. Refs is this little mutable state stuff that lives outside of the virtual DOM. And if I need to forward this ref, there's this sort of like annotation stuff that you have to do. And she like talks about this thing called forward ref, and there's these little like patterns. That has actually changed in React 19. And so I think it's
has it?
Yes. And so this is actually like the React can figure it out if you're actually trying to forward the ref. And you don't have to put that extra decorations on it. And so I think it's always important. I don't mean this as like a critique or anything other than any of these books that we read are a point in time, solving a set of problems that are there. It's good. It's always good to just kind of like spot check, especially if she says something in the book that's kind of a juicy problem that's kind of weird and it's kind of a gotcha. It should set off your spidey sense that it's possible that the community tried to programmatically solve this in future versions. So I always just like to give a reminder. I did this more actually the second half of the book. Actually, most of the Kindle reading that I did was on my computer, which is not normal.
Interesting.
Because I wanted to click the demo buttons here and there. Not always, but it was enough things that I was looking it up actively as I was reading the book. And I never read books like this normally for the podcast, but just kind of giving that little disclosure.
Well, it's I mean, the React team could just read this book and be like, and everything she points out and is like, this is weird. It's weird we have to do this. They should be like, yeah, you're right. Like, and React 20 can address it.
Right.
This book did help kind of refs click for me because, you'll have kind of like the use ref hook in React. And if you've ever done React, and especially if you're kind of like vibe coding in React, or just, I guess in the olden days, hacking and slashing your way through Stack Overflow until something works, you'd eventually get to like this is the point where you need to do use ref. And you're like, what the freak? Like, and all you know about use ref is that you really shouldn't do it too much, right? And to me, I was a little like, I don't understand what this is. And this book kind of made it clear that like, when you're creating React elements, right, you're working within the virtual DOM, right? But eventually you might get to a point where it's not enough to do it in the virtual DOM and to trust the React diffing engine and the rendering engine to make everything line up for you. At some point, you might need the actual DOM element. You'll need to access that for whatever reason. This usually comes with like a location on a page, or like if you need the width of an element, like if you're trying to dynamically adjust the size of another element based on the size of this element, then that's when you need to assign it a ref, because you need to get the actual reference to the item in the DOM. And then you can start calling some of those browser APIs on that element. That kind of concept helped me understand, like, oh, okay, so that's what a ref is. Right. That's why we have to use it. React does a very good job of trying to abstract the DOM away from you. And you don't even really need to worry about it. You can kind of live in your React world, and then React translates that into the, actually painting the DOM. When you get out of that world, that's when you need a ref. And I think that's why when people get to the use ref point, like use ref is almost like a bit of an anti-pattern in itself. Like the whole point of React is that you don't need to worry about the DOM. You've reached a point where you need to worry about the DOM. And so, yeah, that was useful for me to kind of understand, like, okay, that's what this is. That's why when I've used this in the path, I've started, like, it feels a little weird and like a little hacky. It's not, it exists for a reason,
Right.
but you do get a little off the beat and React path once you're doing this sort of stuff.
One of the things I thought, yeah, this is so silly, but I was like, anytime you think you need to reach for use ref, like take a timeout and like really think about what you're doing. But I think again, I'd never thought about when and why. And most of the time it was things I stumbled upon. You're like, oh yeah, in this case you use ref. A lot of times it was dealing with DOM events, right? Dealing with stuff that's outside of the React pieces or some special sort of thing that you needed access to. Again, I'd never thought deeply about refs until this book gave me a whole chapter of in your face reasons that you need to think about it. And all the weird, again, I think anytime you have to switch from one paradigm to the other, you risk doing those anti-patterns and breaking assumptions and not being able to reason about the system. And I actually talk about this later in my hot takes, but like this book really exposes the amount of cognitive load that a good React developer has to have, right? A good React developer has to think about so many things when they're doing something. And I get spoiled with this in like Go or anybody who's doing server-side stuff, because we work really hard to make our environments pristine and make the flow control very like predictable. And in the browser, you're just dealing with stuff coming from 50 different directions. Some of it's self-imposed, but some of it's just the fact that you have an event system where you have to react to all kinds of stuff that's like, crazy.
But does that make React really well designed in the sense, like, just reading through this book, I was like, we teach freshmen React and they do it. And like they, like we teach boot camp grads, like boot camp, like that's the classic stack is like, React for the front end. And, after a 6-month boot camp, you're writing simple React apps. And I think it's like deceptively simple. And then you read a book like this and you're like, holy freaking cow. Like there's so much going on underneath the hood. But like, is it the React? It feels like it equips you with all these foot guns, to shoot yourself in the foot. But at the same time, like plenty of people are soldiering on with mangled feet. Like, is that because React is really well designed, or is it a big mess? I don't know.
I'm on the fence with that too. And I take this because like I think you need to also look at the fact that the Angular community, Vue.js, Svelte and SvelteKit, and these other systems that have emerged that are kind of like React but not React, that maybe use like JSX but don't use the way that React draws things and does all of its refresh patterns. Those communities exist because of shortcomings in React. And I think that React probably they were kind of at the epicenter of saying like, hey, single page applications is a really interesting way that we can build stuff. And I think they deal with a lot of the legacy decisions that were made that made sense at the time. But I will say that reading through the advanced React pieces, I think this also solidifies the fact that like, I don't think I'd want to transition to being a full-time React developer.
Right.
Like it's not, on one hand, you can build really amazing stuff that's in people's hands, right? Like it's running right in front of people's faces in browsers on mobile devices. Because we don't talk about it here, but React Native is another pretty amazing paradigm. And like a lot of this stuff's transferable, right? React Native, of course, gives you the ability to have high performance mobile applications using the things from React. And so it's eaten the world. It's useful. But at the same time, like, I don't know. I don't know. I look at this and I appreciate it. And I know if I'm going to get into doing this stuff, I will. But I would want to like spend enough time in React to do the thing I want to do and then go back to writing the, cool backend architecture that makes the data get served to it as easy as possible,
I see the appeal in being like a full-time React developer. I think about our application, which is not complicated. It's kind of like 3 micro front ends. And even that, I think, decision is Leland was built at the time when like microservices were all the rage.
Right.
And like, so the first engineers, I think, kind of over index on that. But there's like a Java monolith service. They're all kind of deployed the same way, using Amazon ECS. We've got some open telemetry monitoring, right? But like, it's not rocket science what we're doing. But I look at just what we've built, and like, I feel like I just don't have the time to really dive it like deep into any particular part and be like, I understand this completely. Having to do with like the actual Java application. When we use like this, it's funny, the founder, the CEO of our company, he was an employee at LinkedIn before starting Leland. And so a lot of the early engineers were like people he knew at LinkedIn. And so like, there'll be kind of like these weird patterns in the code base. Like, what is this? Like, I've never seen something like this. And then like, I'll be like, our URL structure was one thing like that. I'm like, I've never really quite seen a URL structure like this. And at LinkedIn the other day, I was looking at the URL structure. I was like, aha, I'm like, that's where this comes from.
That's funny.
But it's, anyhow, but like, we have this library called like Parsec in Java for like doing like a lot of like kind of like task resolution and asynchronous processing. I barely understand it because I've just been focused on everything else. All that to say that like, we're not even that big. The architecture, there's not too much, but I feel like the architecture is already distributed enough that I'm not able to dive super deep into any particular problem. Even like Amazon ECS, like I'm not really sure what the underlying like compute mechanism that's running my servers is, right? Like, I don't know. Like, I wish I had more time to focus on that. I see the appeal of being like, if you're a front end React developer and like you install your repo and you're like, for the most part, you're like, my world lives in this repo. My whole job is to optimize this repo.
Right.
And I'm not like, I don't mean that in like a condescending way. Like, heaven knows that especially some of these big companies like Nadia working at Atlassian, working on Jira, right? Like, that's a huge deal. Like, for most people, Jira is defined by the front end experience. I think it's really, really cool to sink your teeth into it. Yeah, I see the appeal.
That's a good point. And I hadn't thought about that. Also, some of the software engineers that I have like a lot of respect for that I've worked with in my career happen to just be like amazing front end React folks. They're full stack, right? But they
Right,
are actually like really great at understanding how to make performant, maintainable React code. And I have the utmost respect. It's just when I look at it and go, like, what would I want to do? You have to ask yourself those questions. I want to be able to have an intelligent conversation. I want to be able to touch React code and, be engaging in that way. But I think this has solidified the fact that I don't know if I'd want to make this my daily driver. Like I don't want to run Node on the back end and live in TypeScript, JavaScript world all day.
Right.
Though I wouldn't like be furious or run away. Or I also think that teams who do pick that as their stack, it's very pragmatic and it makes a lot of sense. Especially if you start doing some of the secret sauce like what Next.js does.
Right.
That gives you amazing tooling that builds on top of all this React stuff that we're talking about.
Minor tangent. How involved are you in the hiring process at work? Do you do a ton of hiring, or is your company just in general doing any hiring right now?
We're not doing any hiring right now, and I've been deeply involved in hiring in other companies.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we're just trying to hire right now. It's interesting just because the job market is like in a weird place,
Right.
But it's in a weird place for both like employers and employees, in that like what we're looking for right now is, and our requirements, I will say that they are not maybe easily attainable, but they are simple, which is really, it's just this. We are looking for a senior front-end engineer with experience in Next.js, specifically Next.js. We're getting to the point where we might take someone who just had a lot of React experience in general, who is willing to become the expert in Next.js, because we use Next.js. And it is crazy. We don't have like any applicants that match that. I mean, make no mistake, we have like 3,000 applicants, right? But we haven't found hardly anyone that does Next.js. And it's concerning for us just because like, even if we had applicants, like then we have to convince, like one, we can only get people who live within commuting distance of Lehi, Utah, which we have some advantage there. If you're not familiar with Utah, geography, and why would you be? It's basically all one giant suburb that runs along the mountain front between Salt Lake City and Provo, Utah. Provo's where BYU is. Anyhow, so Lehigh is right dang in the middle of it. So we actually have access to kind of like most of the population of Utah. But then we also work in office 5 days a week, which obviously is not an easy sell for most people these days. Anyhow, but it's like we don't even have a candidate. We don't have a single person whose resume has come across where we say, hey, this person would be good.
Wow.
So I don't know. It's like, I guess if you're out there, like start learning Next.js. Maybe people, maybe it's a valuable skill, but I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from our listeners if it's strange to me that we're in this situation where we don't have like a single candidate. But maybe we're already filtering ourselves out because of the in-office requirement. Who knows? But I've talked about it in this podcast before, like being in person again and having done remote for a while and just kind of evaluating the two and being like, okay, what do I like? What do I not like? What's easier? What's harder? This is one thing that is just 100% harder, because if we were remote, like I'm sure there's a handful of good Next.js developers on the market right now,
Right.
but they all live in Ohio or Georgia
or Silicon Valley, right? I mean,
or Silicon Valley, right? That's the other thing. It's like, because then you're like, oh, well, if you're in person in Silicon Valley, it'd be easier, but it wouldn't, because now you're one of like 1,000 startups, that are all trying to hire Next.js developer.
Incredibly competitive, right? Yeah,
right.
That's
right.
Yeah, it is interesting too, because choosing a specialization in a framework is tough. Also, it's interesting. You guys are running Next.js not in Vercel,
right?
If I understand that correctly, which is it's also its own trade-offs, because I think from what I understand from the community is that Vercel kind of like, I mean, because they're the creators of Next.js, their infrastructure is like finely tuned to it. You can absolutely, it's open source, so you can absolutely run it wherever, but you lose some of the like magic that you get if you use Vercel natively. But of course, Vercel runs on AWS and has a markup on top of AWS to charge the end user. So.
I think we still got a lot of those great startup AWS credits. And so, but it was funny, just speaking of open telemetry, they were like, yeah, so ever since we did the AWS migration, like we got off Azure onto AWS, like our costs have skyrocketed. Like, what's that about? And like, no one had really cared because we're still on the AWS startup credits, but it was metrics. I had exported a decent amount of custom metrics to CloudWatch, and like they charge a ridiculous amount for those. So I don't know.
Metrics are expensive.
Watch out for them.
Yeah. And that's really where that open telemetry sampling thing comes in.
Right.
So moving forward in this book, I think I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit. I mean, is there anything did you want to talk about the closures section or?
No, not the closures section. What are you skipping ahead to?
Chapter 11, actually. So there's this implementing advanced debouncing and throttling with refs, right? So it builds on top of the refs chapter that we were in. Have you ever had to? I didn't appreciate debouncing until we actually needed to do it in production, like for an application that we had. Have you ever had to like hop into this kind of stuff, or is this something that you're just like, I didn't see the magic in this chapter?
No, I mean, this is another one that I think I read at like 11:30 at night when I was falling asleep. And so as far as how much stuck, I don't know. I'm interested to get your take on it, because we have done debouncing. In fact, I was just working on a debouncing bug the other day. This one was very tricky to kind of test, because like Next.js introduces some kind of stuff with server-side rendering. It was a search bar. And that's the example she gives here too, is a search bar that like you don't want to send a backend event if you're typing React every time you type R and then E and then A and then C. But the way that our server-side rendering works is when it's done, it updates the query param, and then we refresh the page. And then with that query param, when the page refreshes, we send the request back off. And then, we populate the page. Next.js with its server-side rendering makes it pretty zippy, but our local development is not very zippy with Next.js. And so that's tough to kind of like get a feel for how it's all working. And we were just winding up with weird things where it was like, you type in REA quickly, but then you wait just a second. And while you've waited, it's kind of triggered the whole refresh the page thing. So if you type C right when that's happening, the page will refresh and wipe out your C. And so like we were getting into like debouncing stuff and like coupled with server side rendering. I think we just waved the white flag on it.
So I'm going to play
like,
devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that that would actually query a server side renderer, because
Right.
this is where like, you know, what they call like isomorphic patterns that they're kind of cool in React, which is that I think this would actually be a good use case for it being a client side component.
Yeah, I would agree.
But if you do a cold render, so the client side component should do all of that stuff in the browser, but update the URL without doing a redraw. But if you copied and pasted that, it would be really nice if it's server side rendered and then hydrated through the server side rendering. And this is where React, especially with server side rendering, gets really weird. You're like, can I do state changes client side or server side and get the same output? Right. Can I do something that's using the fetch API and doing some of the cool stuff without having to do more server side rendering calls? Versus, but again, I'm not gonna. I don't know the inner workings of y'all's app, but this actually gets into 2 points. Number one, yes, debouncing. And for the uninitiated, this is debouncing actually comes all the way back from people who did electronic circuitry.
Oh yeah.
So the idea was that when they pressed a button down, a button press on an actual physical switch will bounce. Like your humans when you press it. And so it would, if you hit a button, it could trigger the button 3, 4, 5 times without you even noticing it. And so you had to put this logic in there that basically says only take an event within some event window, right? So with a 300 millisecond delay, if it gets triggered 5 times, ignore everything up to the final delay. And then after that delay comes through, register the event, right? Register the button press or whatever. And so, yeah, this is what allows you to, and you see this in Google search, you see this in the Leland search or anything. I start typing, and when I'm kind of like pause to think about what I want to type next, a bunch of suggestions come down, right? This is where Google's trying to read your mind. And sometimes you're like, that's not what what this is what people are searching. Like, what? But it's a fun problem to think about. I think if you've ever needed to try to design a debouncer on your own, I would say this is an excellent exercise. You're probably going to do it wrong, but it's a good one to think about. Like, how would I write my own debounce implementation? And it's just it's like writing a quine. I don't know if you've ever written a quine before, and you know what that is.
No.
A quine is a computer program where its output is the source code of the program itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the program writes itself as its output. So when you execute the program, and it's surprisingly difficult in most programming languages to do this because there's all this weird escaping that you have to do. You have to kind of understand how, however the text is written, things like this. Again, another homework assignment for the listener. If you've never written a quine before, pick your favorite programming language and try to write a program in which the output is byte for byte identical to the source code that you're writing to get that output. It's a fun one. And I would say it's in the same vein as like writing a debouncer. And it's that like, you're like, this is surprisingly something to think about. And one of the things that I bring up in this chapter though, is that using refs is an excellent primitive for doing things like I'm watching keyboard inputs and I only want to redraw, re-render after a 500 millisecond delay from the last key press, right? And she gives this a really good breakdown of how they're using refs in combination with these keystrokes and using these debouncing logic or using these throttling logic. It's just a nice way to like cleanly define it. And again, it was not that long of a chapter, but it was a good one. And I love the debounce problem.
Yeah. I think I remember first learning about debouncing in like my first job right out of school. Being like, what the freak is this?
Yeah.
Right? Like, but yeah, not necessarily advanced React, but the way she goes about implementing it using the refs it's a neat solution.
Yeah, exactly. I thought it was clever, and it's one of those things where again, Osterhout talks about this, right? If you can encapsulate complexity, because by the end of it, you have this really simple component that just kind of handles the thing, right? It just handles this in a like nice and clean way. And that's like, to me, is good software design, because I would want to be able to hand this off to a junior dev and be like, here's our form validation logic, and here's our debounce stuff. You don't have to worry about it, just know it's in there. Here's how we build forms here, right? Here's the components that you're going to use, and just know that you have to like pass this stuff in and you're good, right? That way, if they want to deep dive, they can. But in their case, it's like, oh, we're using Z for validation, and we have this debounce thing, and like knowing that we have like a sophisticated form input field, that's our way of doing it. That to me is like, I'm giving a gift to my other software engineers.
Right.
And so I love those, because you're like, yeah, this is a juicy problem, non-trivial. I know how we want to do stuff here. I can give you a component that just does it.
Right. We're at the funny point where with our React code base, we're like, no one really working. Like we all know enough React to be dangerous, but then it's also a team full of very competent engineers who like are familiar with like the fundamentals of kind of software development in general. So every time I work in our code base, I'm like, I know this doesn't seem right. I know that there's got to be some other pattern, but like there's nothing that jumps out immediately. Like I never open up a file that's like 100,000 lines long, right? And it's just like, like there's no, or like you're not seeing like the same thing that really should be a component, like copied and pasted throughout the application, like the
Right.
the same lines of code. Like people are good about putting their stuff in components, reusing things, like not doing a ton of prop drilling. Like so, like I keep looking through the app. I'm like, this feels. I feel like there's got to be some improvements we could make here. I'm not exactly sure what they are. But again, that's why we're trying to hire like a senior Next.js, React engineer with like Next.js experience. So yeah, I don't know. Like, and reading this book, I talked about this last week. Like, I feel like I'm just being cursed with knowledge. Like now I know all these things. Now I know, right? Like that something's wrong, but like I feel like I don't quite have the expertise necessary yet to really dive deep into a React app and be like, oh, this thing is clearly broken. There are some cool things you learn here. I mean, chapter 12 talks about kind of like flickering UI that you'll get with like use effect. This is again one of the kind of like quirks of like just how React works in general, and the whole painting the DOM, and basically what if your use effect is like the kind of classic hook for like, oh, I want to monitor this value, and when this value updates, I would like to perform an action. And so in this case, they're talking about like, what if you had a list of buttons that when it that like based on how many buttons are in the list and kind of like the size of the list, that might influence where you position a button at the end of the list, like the more button that you click on, right? And so you might think, oh, this is really good. I will just kind of do a use effect on that list of buttons, and then when that's done, I will grab the ref from it and then use that to adjust the DOM, right? And to position that more button at the end. But because use effect runs asynchronously, what's going to happen is it's going to paint the DOM with that list of buttons. It's going to say, oh, okay, I've got the information I need. Let's do the use effect now. And then it's going to paint the DOM again to add that more button at the end. And what you get is the flickering UI.
Yeah.
React has a solution for this. It is not use effect. It's called use layout effect. And basically what this does is it runs synchronously. It waits until and she kind of points out that like previously the solution, like the use effect problem, was like you would render things invisibly, like give it like an opacity of 0, and then once use effect triggers, then you would do it. Use layout effect was invented to kind of get rid of that problem, and instead it waits until it renders, so to speak, and gives you that information you need. It runs synchronously and then does it kind of all at once.
Yeah.
Right.
And it does. It talks about the fact that like use layout effect. She gets really into like how things get painted in the browser, and the fact that we're 60 frames per second, and it does all these like, it really kind of gets into the weeds, and it's like, should we even have to be thinking about this? There's this like whole concept. She does talk about the fact that server-side rendering complicates this, and actually you can't use layout effect as a blocking thing because server-side rendering, there is no browser. I will say she also mentions it, but it's become a big deal since React 16. But there's now a component called suspend, right?
Suspense or suspend?
Suspend. Yeah, suspend. And suspend changes this again, right? So in suspend, I can do that. And you'll see all the React apps do this now, right? You'll load a page and literally no content's drawn yet, but a bunch of these like ghost, the thing, like you look at like where a video is going to be and maybe all the content for the recommended videos on the side. And they'll kind of like have this like placeholder animation thing. As you can tell, it's kind of giving you feedback that they're querying that data. Suspend does this really easily. You basically just say, hey,
Right.
It's writing an IOU saying, hey, server-side render, just draw this thing that's going to like not do a UI flash. And then asynchronously, we know that client side, we're going to pull that stuff in, or asynchronously, when the data is ready, it's going to come down and hydrate. So I think there are more tools in our tool belt to think about this, because I think there's a lot of benefits to server-side rendering that has really kind of taken the React world by storm over the last 3 versions.
Right.
But again, I'm really glad that use layout effect is something I didn't know about it. I really didn't know about use layout effect. And sometimes I'm like, you know what, this is actually the right solution. I'm willing to block the whole thing until it draws.
It's one of the things that like in this world of, new world of like LLMs makes so interesting, because like in the past I could see that being like really, really valuable to know as a senior engineer. It's kind of like your silver bullet. You're like, what the freak? How does this work? I'm getting this flicker. And like, that's the exact kind of thing I could imagine talking to a senior engineer and them being like, oh yeah, well, you need to use layout effect. Like that's what you need here. It seems like the sort of thing that I could imagine like a Claude Code or a ChatGPT kind of knowing intuitively if you were able to describe your problem well. I don't know. I've never gotten to a point where it's recommended to use layout effect. But I think it kind of, there's a lot of, it's a new world and it's weird. And there's a lot of, I'm constantly reevaluating, right? Like how much some of this domain knowledge matters now. Like we were getting like a dependency issue in our node service the other day. And the answer was to like exclude a particular module from like the Webpack, process. And like ChatGPT or Claude Code just recommended that to me. And like I took my time and I was like, wait, why does this fix what it's doing? Walk me through the pros and cons of this again. Like I wanted to make sure I understood what I was doing. But it's that kind of like silver bullet where like I would have spent hours researching this, right? And honestly, probably just would have given up trying to use the library where you're using it and get something else. Claude Code fixed it in 5 minutes. And so, I don't know. I think about it kind of like the Linux graybeards, right? The people have just been in the trenches for so long and know the ins and outs of everything. Like, how useful is that today? Obviously still useful, but it's different. It's a different paradigm.
Yeah. I think skipping ahead a bit, I think that another really fun and juicy area was chapter 14, which is data fetching on the client.
Oh, yeah.
And again, as soon as you want your application to start doing things that are interesting, and especially what React does really well, which is that, maybe you've pulled down, when you query a URL, it pulls down the React and, hydrates all the stuff that you want, but you're probably doing direct data queries from the browser, right? It's like one of the things that's pretty normal. You might be hitting another API endpoint that isn't where the React app is being served from. You're not doing the traditional client server model. And there's a lot of interesting and weird things that can happen, right? Both on what decisions to make before the data is available, also race conditions that can happen, right? And I think that this is the first chapter that I think really starts digging into race conditions, talks about promises, talks about all these other things. And again, this is one of those things that the chaos is that the default in JavaScript, the primitives aren't there. For instance, like in Go, I'm just going to bring this up in Go. Go has these things called Go routines, which allow you to like easily spin stuff off. And it's got criticism because it doesn't give you a lot of like flow control stuff. But the community created this thing called context, which I think is heavily borrowed from context in Java. And this is idea that you pass in this argument called context, and it lets you do things like cancel asynchronous things mid-flight, or, it has like a done and cancel and some other flow control stuff. And by default, JavaScript, most folks don't do this. They do like a promise promise.all or something. And unless you have some callback or something that can go in and cancel those promises, let's say you get some piece of data, the rest of the data is irrelevant, or that you cancel the process, all of those promises are still running in the background, right? Or maybe there's one of those promises finishes before another one, and you really wanted the second query, but the second query actually comes in first for whatever reason, and then the first query finishes and then overwrites the data from the second query. If you're not careful, these things can happen all the time, just because of how asynchronous network communication can work. And so I appreciated that she set a really good context of all the crazy. I always think of it as like spinning plates. Like asynchronous stuff in JavaScript is like, how many plates am I spinning? And if I spin too many plates, I'm going to start dropping plates, right? I want to spin enough plates that I can like keep running around and like spinning the plates. If you have too many, they're going to start breaking, and bad stuff happens.
Yeah, and this is another weird one. Well, I just like JavaScript wise, when like you hear like JavaScript is single threaded, like it doesn't, like support asynchronous by default. You're like, well, what does that mean? And then you're like, well, when you fetch, you're not actually doing JavaScript, you're farming it out to the browser. And then the browser takes care of it for you. I just remember learning that. Like, what on earth is going on? I remember I was doing some reading about the event loop earlier this week, trying to understand that. And like, that's when I found out, and this isn't strictly related to data fetching, but like set timeout, the way that works is like, you say like, okay, wait 1,000 milliseconds. But the way that it works is basically like, again, I think that's another one. It delegates out to the browser, and then after 1,000 milliseconds, it sticks it back on the stack, and the event loop then picks it up. But just by nature of that, like I always thought, like set timeout was guaranteeing you to be 1,000 millisecond wait. It's not a guarantee. It guarantees it will be no less than 1,000 milliseconds, which like in the JavaScript world means it'll be like 1,001 or 1,002 milliseconds. But I guess if you ever need exactly 1,000 milliseconds, maybe avoid it. Looking at this, we do a lot of kind of like promise.all stuff and parallel promises, and that this is actually something where I was looking at it, and just from my knowledge of like how promises work, and we use GraphQL, where I was like, I think we're doing this wrong in GraphQL, because the whole point of GraphQL is like, you shouldn't need to be doing a bunch of different, like 5 different GraphQL promises that like you get the data all back and then do it there. Like you should have one giant GraphQL, request, and then it gives you all the data back at once. Like that's kind of the magic of GraphQL.
Especially because you can now, GraphQL for years now, we were early users of GraphQL at the startup that I had back in 2015 to 2017. I think it was 2017 we had made the transition to GraphQL. The streaming API wasn't that mature at that point, or maybe even non-existent from official support. But yes, you can make these big, juicy GraphQL queries, and then as long as if you know some of that data is asynchronous, that it'll come in or it's stream when it's available. Yeah, doing one big GraphQL query and then letting the resolver do all of the heavy lifting of figuring out the most appropriate way of packaging that data up to send to you. Yeah. No, it's interesting because if you let every component manage itself, it's kind of cool in that it kind of like, you can reason about each little thing, but you start getting to these bigger things where you're like, hey, why are we hitting the GraphQL endpoint, 15 different times, where it might be better for us to have like a more efficient query that, pulls that data down.
Yeah, but you can tell it's just kind of one of those things that's like stapled on. We have an engineer on our team I work with, who I really admire. He's the kind of guy that kind of goes the extra mile, and just like, well, when we have a task, he'll kind of be like, yeah, we could just like staple it on this way. Or if we did a little bit of extra work, we could kind of refactor it to do it what is the more appropriate way. And I don't always have the patience to do what he does. And so I'm very appreciative that he does it. You had as your hot take, you want to talk about error handling. Because we got time to talk about like one more thing. So maybe we'll talk. This is chapter 16, which is the final chapter, but this is going to bleed over into our hot takes for the week.
Yeah. So, and again, I did some searching from React 16 to like maybe what's changed in React 19, and the current state of error handling, as far as I can understand, is still the same thing. And I think a lot of this just has to do with like architectural choices that were made early on. But basically, from my understanding of this, is that I've definitely gotten tangled up in how error propagation works in React in the past. I think anyone who's trying to handle errors properly can. But this book, again, gave me the vocabulary to understand that there's like, you can't just wrap everything in a try catch, how errors
Right.
bubble up through the system. And the fact that there's like synchronous and asynchronous pathways for how errors bubble up through the system, and that they're not compatible unless you do some special, wrapper logic. I mean, she kind of outlines like how you would write these custom wrapper components to kind of do this stuff. I think there's also a library, I forget the name of it, that she brings up. That's basically, you can
React
use this
error boundary or
that's
something.
it, React error boundary. And she kind of goes into this, but it's one of those things where you realize that like error handling is non-trivial, and you can't just do what a lot of languages do, which is just like do a try catch. And so I guess my hot take is that like error handling in React is a hot mess. That's my hot take.
Yeah, looking at this, I mean, and like there's a difference between like the different kinds of errors. Like I don't remember. Isn't there something like there's something that's more specifically like a React error and like
and now in React has changed, I think, as of version 16. And we've all seen this if you've been in the development environment, and there's that like existential one that just will give you that big black box with the red text that's super ugly. Your whole application halts because it's not happy with something.
Yes.
That used to not be the behavior. React used to kind of just like sort of, render.
Right.
And I guess it's better that it halts, but it will throw you for a loop and like how to find these things. It also gets back, it made me think about John Osterhout again. I thought about him a lot with this, which is that can you factor these errors out of existence, right? Like, do you really want to bubble that error up from something failing in a, input field all the way up to the top? Maybe you do. Or would it be better for you to, it's not a real error, but maybe it is it feeds into some, little modal or alert window that just says that, the email address format is invalid, but it's not really an error, right? It's really just letting letting someone know that, hey, the form field isn't meeting our expectations. Inside the component, that yes, that's kind of an error state, but it's not an error in the sense that like the application's broken, right? Which I think are, kind of two different boundaries.
The placement of this chapter is almost comical in that like you read this whole book on like, here's everything that can go wrong in React. Here's everything you can be doing wrong. It's like, oh, by the way, last thing before we go, error handling is a complete mess in this framework, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you on all that. And I kind of, by the time I got to that chapter, that was my takeaway too. I'm like, wow, like there's a lot going on here. That this is, I think out of all the chapters in this book, that's the one I could see myself coming back to reread the most.
Yeah.
Because like, it's just, some of the other ones, like it's neat stuff. And like in your very particular scenario, you might be like, oh, this is where I use layout effect as opposed to use effect, right? This is how I handle debouncing using a ref. This is the chapter that you'd probably get the most bang for your buck out of and come back to use over and over again. I mean, I talked a bit about this. One of my hot takes, I just think the fact that most people write React without knowing any of this is probably a testament to its resiliency. Like most of the internet you interact with on a day-to-day basis is probably written by people who know 1/10 of what Nadia does, and yet the internet keeps soldiering on. I wonder, like, obviously we have some insight into like how a really senior React engineer at like Nadia works. Like, is she, do all kind of like the big companies have someone like this? Like, does Reddit have someone like Nadia? Facebook, I'm sure obviously they invented React, has someone like Nadia. Is it Google? Are they using React? Do they have someone like Nadia, right? Like, are the applications I'm interacting most with on a day-to-day basis all architected by someone with as much skill as Nadia? Or is the stuff I'm interacting more built by like, I don't know, your kind of rank and file normal React developers? I don't know.
I bet it varies widely company to company. I think as soon as you have a maturity of having at least like staff plus engineering path, I would imagine that the platform engineering type front end folks, if they're in that domain, are probably in that boat where they really understand the primitives and the structure that need to be in place to make scalable, React component, architecture that works for the company. But it takes some deep thought to make sure that you understand how that works.
Well, anything else for you? Any hot takes?
No, as I mentioned earlier, high cognitive load. Again, there's so many things. Not only do I have to understand the browser, not only do I have to understand React, I have to understand the changes that are coming to React. I have to understand the frameworks that are coming out. I have to keep track of all the React developers that are coming up with new and better, libraries. That seems exhausting to me. I'm just like, as an outside observer, I'm just like, oh man, what I knew about React now and what was available to me even a year ago is just different. It's a moving target.
Right. Well, as far as what we're going to do differently in our career this week, I guess I can go first. I'm doing some work with portals this week. We're just doing like a full screen kind of mode for one of the components on our website. And so I just kind of understood like, okay, yeah, I guess a portal is how you handle this. But I'm going to, when I go in today, like just kind of review what I've worked on and make sure I kind of understand it more fully in the context of what Nadia wrote in her chapter.
Yeah, and we skipped that chapter as far as discussion. That one actually went over my head a bit, but I'm not doing a bunch of UI stuff. But again, like how we stack up the layers and stuff and how we
the whole stacking context.
Like a juicy chapter, but yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, this inspired me to play with some debouncing and throttling examples that you had. I just love those, and I was just like, I'm going to try to implement this myself just to kick the tires with React and understand refs and stuff better. So I thought that would be fun.
Well, and then how about recommendations? Who would you recommend the book to?
Yeah, it does not change. So last time I said the book's really for I would say like intermediate to advanced React users. If you know enough to be dangerous, but you find yourself getting tangled up in a more advanced code base, but this is absolutely not a book for people who are new to React. So
yeah, I would agree. And I put something similar. I said, yeah, anyone who's managing a performance critical React app. Again, I'm a little skeptical of how much value how much of this is strictly necessary if your React app isn't like, I'm just imagining someone like who's working like an internal tool that's in a React app. Like, I got to make sure that this is all 100%, Nadia approved. Like, I don't know. Maybe there's not much value out of that. But if you're someone like Nadia, who is on the senior front end platform team at Jira, or you're someone who wants to be like Nadia and wants to ultimately get that position, like, yeah, no better book for you than this. And we've said it several times, but Nadia did really knock it out of the park with this one in terms of like, it's really deep technical content. And again, that can make it a little tricky when you're trying to read it cover to cover, but the structure of this book, her talent as an author, like, yeah, this is more authors should be like Nadia. The tech industry would be greatly blessed if we had more like her. So
completely agree.
Yeah. Congrats, Nadia. And hopefully we'll have Nadia on the podcast one day.
That'd be so cool.
Well, that wraps it up for this week. We will be back next week we're going to do Beyond Vibe Coding, which is one you've recommended, Nathan, right?
Yeah, this was written there's a guy who's on the Google Chrome team over at Google.
Oh, nice.
But he's also just written a bunch and spoke on the topic, and I liked the way he structured things, so I thought it'd be cool. He'd be a great guest potentially if we could get him. So
yeah, absolutely. I'm just readjusting our schedule because we were supposed to take a break this week, but then we wound up taking it a few weeks earlier. So yeah, 2 weeks of Beyond Vibe Coding. Then we're going to read an essay, The Tao of Programming, which we're excited about. That should just be a fun episode. We'll be off for Thanksgiving break, and then we've got some special episodes coming your way. We'll be off for 2 weeks for Christmas break, and then the mother of all tech books, Designing Data-Intensive Applications, is how we're ringing out.
Tackling that at the beginning of next year. Sounds great.
Yep. New year, 2026, started off with a bang. Well, you can always contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. You can find me at Carter Morgan on Twitter. You can find the podcast at Book Overflow Pod on Twitter. Nathan, I know you are working on something. Did you want to share that with the podcast right now?
Not quite yet. So let's just stick to functionally imperative. But yeah, I got something in the works, and we'll be sharing it soon.
Absolutely. So Nathan might have some news for us here soon. Don't worry, nothing affecting Book Overflow. We're here for the foreseeable future.
Positive feedback loop, really. Yeah.
Absolutely. But then Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com is Nathan's newsletter. Thanks again so much for sticking around, folks, and we will see you next week.